that the most important influence on transformation in America's healthcare system today is not something coming from Washington, is not something coming from the health insurance industry. It's something in the minds of the American patient. The American patient has become cynical and doubting of the value and the conscience of the delivery of healthcare. I'm not making value judgment about whether this is good or bad, but it's real. And it's very difficult to measure. American patients don't necessarily take their doctor's advice. They don't necessarily follow various medical specialty guidelines on when they should get screening tests, on when they should go for a regular checkup, on when they should have a blood test. They leave the office and don't get their tests as reliably, if you will, as they once did. What has driven this? I believe the conversation about healthcare reform that's been active, front page active, for several years now, even now that it is law, is the principal driver. The driver is that there was so much political debate, oftentimes, as we would all agree, irrational, unfair, but sometimes accurate. The mindset of the American consumer has changed. If there were no ACA, the mindset of the American consumer would still have changed. And I believe this is the most important factor in the transformation of American healthcare today. Fueling the mindset change is a change that came from the insurance industry, also independent of the ACA. And by the way, I'm a supporter of the ACA. I'd better be, because my partner was the healthcare czar in the Obama administration, Nancy Parr. But the ACA is not the driver of the commercial health insurance industry's rapid inflation of premium pricing over many years now, and employers, and in some cases individual beneficiaries, choosing benefit designs that raise the burden financially on the consumer. So when the patient goes to the doctor and is advised that her hip could be replaced, the out-of-pocket burden has gone from a couple $100 a decade ago to a couple $1,000 today. A hip replacement is not an emergency. That can be deferred, and it is being deferred, as are many other procedures. Unfortunately, in some cases, procedures that are much more essential than an immediate hip replacement. So health insurance benefit design with increasing burden financially on the consumer are turning the patient into a consumer. And the patient is a much better informed consumer as a result of a third driver of transformation, which is information. The patient has access to internet-based, mostly internet-based information in a way that patients never had before. The information is often not reliable, but sometimes it is, and it's out there for everyone to gather. In fact, there's a little known fact, or maybe it's better known than I thought. What do you think is the principal website that physicians use to search information about medical facts outside of their specialty? Any guesses?
Don't tell me Wikipedia.
Wikipedia. Wikipedia. Now, don't be so concerned about Wikipedia, because it's actually damn good. Because it is, as Wikipedia is, democratized. And physicians who find it to be inaccurate, scholars in the field can make adjustments, or there are people who will make adjustments for them. But it's interesting. I think Wikipedia is pretty good. But there's so much information out there. Consumers with a higher financial burden and a very high degree of cynicism can now be better informed. So they're shopping, and they're deferring, and they're scrutinizing. For better or worse, this is, I believe, the most important driver of change in the American healthcare system. On the provider side, as a physician, I'll be curious what Mark thinks about this. For the first time in my physician career, and I don't practice any longer, but I'm still on the medical faculty, physicians, more than on a rare basis, seem to have some conscience about the financial impact of what they're doing. It's early. I would say it's still almost just nascent, but it's happening. It's somewhat more prevalent in younger physicians. They've been trained in a different era, but it's important. The best example of this, some of you, many of you probably read about it, Memorial Sloan Kettering, a group of the oncologists stood up a couple of years ago and said, we should not provide this particular new drug that was much more expensive than its predecessor because the clinical value does not warrant the cost. The oncologists did that, not the insurer. We're not seeing a lot of that, but we're seeing more and more of that. And I think it matters. And I think it also matters that most American physicians, in another dramatic trend that's affecting transformation, are now employed by a larger enterprise and no longer independent practitioners or even in small group practices. And the large multi-specialty group practices look more like a large healthcare institution than they do like a doc practice. And in that kind of environment, the employer says to the employee, we care about cost, so you need to care about cost. I would argue that the ACA and other government intervention have had an important impact directly, separate from the conversation I talked about that's gotten into people's minds. But I don't think it's actually transformational. I think it's incremental. There are pieces of it that are probably going to be transformational. I actually think the High-Tech Act, which was not part of the ACA, as you remember, is probably more transformational in some ways than all of the ACA. But the notion of the ACA is transformational. The notion that we will cover all Americans is critical, is important, and whether you like it or not, is transformational. But the nuts and bolts of it are, in my view, very important, but less transformational than what is going on in the minds of those who are the participants. Now, what are the opportunities going forward for driving further transformation? The largest, most important of all, in my view, and in my firm's view, is the shift from fee-for-service to fee-for-value. The compensation model of physicians needs, and other providers, needs to change in order for there to be an efficient delivery of healthcare, efficient economically as well as procedurally, in this rapidly changing environment. And that compensation mechanism is changing. Now, we saw efforts in this area in the early to mid-1990s with the advent of physician practice management businesses and other models like that. And they almost all failed, not all, but almost all. I think it's different now. I can't prove that, but my colleagues and I think it's different. We think that physicians and other providers being paid for delivering value, where value includes clinical result, but also includes cost saves, is changing the behavior of providers. And we think it will stick, not ubiquitously. There will be fee-for-service, in my opinion, in pockets of the healthcare system forever in the United States, or maybe for just a very long time, I don't know, forever. But the fee-for-service model is eroding, and when you shift the incentive, oh, what a dramatic effect it has on utilization of care, style of delivery of care, and cost. There are some negative ramifications. I'm not suggesting this is all good, but it's happening. And I'll close my introductory remarks with this, circling back to the wisdom of Albert Brooks. The biggest obstacle to the necessary transformation of our healthcare system is society's perpetual commitment to prolonging life. Now, I'm not specifically speaking about end-of-life care. It's very important. I'm not specifically citing the elderly, debilitated, never going to recover patient who's in an ICU running up hundreds of thousands of dollars of bills. I think most Americans agree that that probably isn't necessary, including the patient's family. I'm talking about something broader than that. I'm talking about the societal ambition to prolong life, where every incremental discovery that increases life by weeks or months, or even years, is necessary. And I'm not making a value judgment that it's not necessary. Actually, if you ask my personal opinion, I'd say it is necessary. I want a society that has that goal. What other goal? What are the other important goals? I mean, quality of life, of course, is probably more important than length of life. But the innovation revolution in life sciences and healthcare delivery is dramatic. Do I even need to mention hepatitis C? It's dramatic. It's fantastic. It's unbelievable. The opportunity to create and as is being created, dramatic innovative treatments in not only hepatitis C, but congestive heart failure, in many solid tumors, in the hematologic malignancies. And I can go on and on. It is dramatic. It's exciting. It's what we've been building through NIH funding, through some of the pharmaceutical industry, through global funding, similar to NIH. It's what we've been after. We're having huge successes, but it's so expensive. Every time a new drug is discovered that has a real, forget about the 2 weeks of extended life in pancreatic cancer. Let's talk about curing hepatitis C. Every time a new discovery hits the scene, there may be an economic argument that over many years it's a cost saver. That could be true. But in the short term, who can pay $84,000 times hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans? Some people think millions, by the way. You know, so this perpetual pursuit of longevity, which I personally support, is the biggest obstacle to solving our healthcare system's financial problems. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague.
So 4 main points. First, I urge you all to go to the Institute of Medicine's website. If you Google IOM Best Care, there's a study that was published about 2 years ago called Best Care at Lower Cost, the report of the Committee on the Learning Healthcare System in America. It's a committee that I chaired. And the reason it's important is not that I chaired it, but because it had everybody from the CEO of Kaiser Permanente, the CEO of Virginia Mason Medical Center, a former astronaut, a cardiothoracic surgeon, a nurse academic, a pharmaceutical company executive, a broad group of people. And our committee came up with a number of findings that I think are relevant for this discussion. One is that we waste a huge amount of money in healthcare in America on low value or no value care. That's important. It's important for people in healthcare to say that because it gives permission, as Mitch said, for people in healthcare to start to identify the places where we are spending resources without helping patients. And it helps break through this myth that less resources for healthcare necessarily means lower quality care, the thing with which the public is always threatened at every sign of reform. The government messing with this is somehow going to reduce the care. The second thing that we talked about was complexity. I'm following up Mitch's theme here. In many ways, our system is a victim of its own success. The number of diagnostic and therapeutic modalities we have is now sufficiently great that they cannot be managed by the unaided human brain. And so this notion that your doctor somehow knows everything by reading journal articles. If you sat down and read just the journal articles in your specialty and you started at 9 in the morning on Monday and you took an hour for lunch and you read journal articles, nothing else, no patients, no recreation, just read journal articles, 7 hours a day, 6 days a week, at the end of the first week you'd be 1 month behind. So that's a good thing because we can do so much more for our patients than we could when Mitchell and I were here, but our systems for managing this complexity are 20 years behind the systems of most other major sectors. So I'm an AIDS doc. There's no one more aware than I of the huge contributions that have been made by our successes. I was telling Mitch, one of my favorite patients is a guy who's 71 years old, just had his hip replaced successfully. I don't know if it was Smith and Nephew or Stryker or who. Walks his grandchildren to school. He takes one pill once a day for his HIV. It's a miracle. It's literally a miracle. And yet, the cost of that pill and the complexity of the organizations we've built up to deliver that pill to him require a level of organization that is way beyond what healthcare is used to in sophistication. So the notion that we can get along in a carriage industry with distributed information and without benchmarks and modern industrial organization is just a myth. When I went off to chair this committee, a friend of mine said, "Oh, Jesus, the IOM, this system is broken, everything's all messed up." I said, you know, you're right. And it's part of why we tried to make the point to healthcare providers, it's not your fault. If you start off by telling people the system is all messed up and it's your fault, you're dumb, you're stupid, you had it all wrong, you made the wrong choice, it's not your fault, doctor. The reason things are messed up is that our system is now tremendously more complex than it was when you were in training, and we've got to adapt to a new level of biomedical and organizational sophistication. The third thing that our committee did that I thought was important was point the way towards the kinds of organizations and learning systems that will be necessary to handle this information. Forget proteomics and genomics and all the stuff that's coming, just the stuff that we have now. And so this brings me to this theme of disruption that is for this conference. Now, I'm a big fan of Clayton Christensen and disruptive innovation. I know some of you know what that means, but remember, disruptive innovation does not mean the latest and greatest technology, the most bells and whistles. It often means something that's cheaper, that's good enough, that doesn't necessarily meet all the needs of your best customers, but meets the needs of a group of customers who are not able to afford your current product, right? Southwest Airlines. When Southwest Airlines was invented, it did not compete with Pan Am, it competed with Greyhound. Right? So what we need in healthcare is disruptive innovation, which is to say not necessarily more and more gilded lilies, but care that's good enough for the millions of people, virtually everybody in this country, who can't afford the current product. When the average health insurance premium cannot be afforded by the average American, we've got the classic situation of a product that is over-engineered and too expensive for the market. So, can we trust the people who are experts in disruptive innovation, our friends from Silicon Valley, to come along and save us? I'm not so sure. Anybody remember Healthion? Jim Clark, Netscape? RIP. Anyone remember Revolution Health? Steve Case, AOL, RIP. Anyone remember Google Health, Sergey Brin? I was on that committee, RIP. So it turns out that a lot of would-be disruptors who were very smart about technology saw all this money, all this inefficiency, all this dysfunction in healthcare and said, I could do that. And it turns out they couldn't. And part of the reason they couldn't is that we incumbents are so strong. We are so good at holding off disruptors. Our power over the culture, over the regulatory apparatus, our capacity to hold off those who would replace us, it's as if Barnes and Noble owned the legislature, and when they saw Amazon coming, said, you know, this would be terribly dangerous. The book-reading public cannot afford the dangerous possibility of actually getting Edith Piaf when you wanted Natalie Cole. It's as if you put the tellers union in charge of where and when ATMs could be located. It's as if you said, you can use Google, but you have to have a master's in library science. So in fact, we have been fairly successful in holding off disruptors, and many of the disruptors that have poked their heads up through the ground in the last few years, rather than putting the incumbents out of business, have been absorbed and co-opted by them. The new generation of internet-enabled health plans bought up, subsumed within the morass of the incumbent plans. iTriage, now Aetna. Health insurance, Allstate. So it's kind of as if Ford had looked at Tesla and said, yeah, we'll buy them and we'll shove them back in a corner somewhere. So, I too am hopeful like Mitch. What's going to allow disruptive innovation to transform our industry as it has transformed so many others? One is exactly this notion that more and more people are paying out of their pockets for health care. That is to say, there will be a demand for less expensive care. The takeoff of the minute clinics of the world, something that the incumbent said would never happen. You know, doctors love to think that they are so beloved by their patients, right? Oh, my patients would never go see a nurse at Walmart because they love me. Wrong. 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon with a crying kid, they will go see anybody who can help them. And it turns out, by the way, that the nurse practitioners at the Minute Clinic are better at following the pediatrician's guidelines than the pediatricians are. In part because they don't feel empowered to say, I don't need no stinking guideline, I'm a pediatrician. Right? So the first thing that will happen is more and more people are on the hook for this money, and so there's a demand for a lower cost alternative. And the second thing, to reinforce what Mitch said, is that there is growing recognition within healthcare of how much money we're wasting. So I'll go beyond the oncologists. There's a phenomenon called choosing wisely, in which specialties have, now in concert with Consumers Union, been publishing the 5 things we're doing a lot of that we should not be doing. MRIs for uncomplicated back pain, antibiotics for viral URIs, chemotherapy in the last 2 weeks of life. So when you've got the leaders of the specialty saying this is low value care, as you say, it's not a greedy health insurance executive, it's not a clueless government bureaucrat, it's the president of the American Academy of MRI-indom saying enough with the MRIs for uncomplicated back pain. This is a very important development. Doesn't make it happen, but it gives permission to the Kaisers of the world and the Virginia Masons of the world and the Geisingers and the Intermountain Health Cares to create systems that direct patients away from low-value care. So I actually am encouraged that despite actually the rather dismal track record of disruptive innovation in healthcare, that the conditions are now set, both the technological capability, the capacity for high school graduates to do diagnosis that it used to take physicians to do, and for high school graduates and parents, frankly, to follow many of the protocols that we now have licensed professionals following. That technical capability exists, the market demand for lower cost care exists, and I believe increasingly that the cultural precedents exist. The one area where I disagree with Mitch, I agree with Mitch entirely that focusing on quantity of life is an important problem. I think the single biggest obstacle to the kind of transformation that we're both talking about actually is us. I think it's doctors. In fact, if you look at how doctors die in a much less aggressive form than they prescribe for their patients. So in some ways, doctors, more than anybody else, understand really what it's like to go through these futile forms of care. And so my sense is, to the extent that we, who are incumbents in the industry and who, like all incumbents, have frankly benefited, those of us who are successful because we have benefited from the old model. To the extent that our ability to block disruptive innovation, to block this transformation, is increasingly weakened, both because we recognize the need to change and because the forces promoting innovation are getting stronger. I think that's the principal source of hope. Thanks.